All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 5, talking about editing this time around. Let's get into some of the basics. The basic way a producer manipulates sound is by the means of splicing and dubbing. Splicing is the process of cutting, pasting, and copying sound files. When you're looking at your waveform in Adobe Audition or Audacity or whatever digital audio workstation you are using, if you are taking that sound file and you are removing a portion of it, or you are adding something to it from another sound file, or you're making a copy of what's already there, that is the process of splicing. Dubbing is the process of reproducing or transferring a sound file in one form of media to another. It's also known as extracting or ripping. But basically, it's the idea of taking something and recreating it, something that sounds the same, is the same as it is, except it now takes on a different form. The process of making a mirror image of that computer file is called copying or duplicating. And then mixing refers to combining discrete sound files together into a finished audio production. So you have sound piece A, sound piece B. Somehow those things meld together to create sound piece C. Whether they're mixed completely together or just in part, that is mixing. Editing is a combination of these functions. It's the process of rearranging, correcting, and assembling sound into a finished product. So any combination of splicing and dubbing, we consider that to be editing. Two main types of editing that we tend to use when we're in the studio are destructive editing and non-destructive editing. Destructive editing occurs when a change is made that alters the structure of the sound file, and this results in a change that cannot be undone. In other words, once you've saved your edited work, the original is gone forever. That is destructive editing. Non-destructive editing occurs when the original audio components are retained and can be reused if a change in the audio file, like an edit, does not work out to your satisfaction. So up to the point that you save a file and you overwrite it, the original MP3 or waveform or whatever you're doing, you have the option to undo certain things that you've done. Remember, in Adobe Audition, Control-Z is your friend. And as long as you still have that capability, you have the power of non-destructive editing. Another good example of non-destructive editing is when you work in a session file and you have multiple individual MP3s or waves that you're working with and you're manipulating those things around. That is also non-destructive editing, because even after you've done the mix down and saved a new MP3, you still have the original MP3s that have not been changed as a result of the work that you've done. Let's take a look at the waveform. What is a waveform? It's a visual representation of a sound file. Good reference for you is in your textbook to be able to visualize what that waveform looks like. You can determine certain types of information just by looking at the waveform. If it's a musical selection, you might be able to tell the rhythm of the song based on peaks and valleys. The places where the sound gets louder, you should be able to see a larger difference in that waveform from its center, which is 0, which is silence. If it's a vocal selection, you might be able to see the words being spoken, and that's in quotes. The more you get familiar with how waveforms look and picturing in your mind what words look like, if the spoken word could be visually seen, that's pretty much what a waveform tries to do, and you can gauge based on the look of the waveform when someone starts speaking a sentence or finishes a sentence, where they take a pause. If you're musically inclined, where certain beats and rhythms may fall into place. And that's something that when you've worked with audio for a while, you get better at being able to determine, at least in an approximate way, where certain things happen within time and space of a piece of audio. Splicing and editing a sound file. The most common reason for cutting a sound file and sticking it back together is to eliminate an unwanted portion of the sound file. A small portion of a larger file selected for use is commonly called a sound bite. So if we think of a sound bite as a portion of a larger piece of audio, there may be certain sound bites that we do not want to include in our final product for one reason or another. It could be that it's a continuous recording and someone made a mistake that we want to edit out. It could also be that perhaps we're working on a news piece, for example, and there's only a certain portion of what somebody said that we recorded that we really want to use for a particular purpose. That would also be an example. Alternatively, a producer may choose to rearrange portions of a sound file into a more logical sequence or simply shorten what has been recorded. It's not unusual for a producer to take a piece of sound and rearrange so that something that was said later on in a dialogue is actually presented first before something else to help create context for a certain reason, or because there was something that was said later in the dialogue that is of more importance, and something that was said in the beginning might actually explain that item of importance. There are several reasons that you may want to rearrange audio. Actualities are recordings like reporter audio, interviewees, station listeners that may have been edited prior to air. So when we talk about some of these sound bites that we're using on the air, such as these different elements or other things, we may call them actualities because they are things, you can think of it this way, these are things that people have actually said and we are using for on-air purpose. So that's an actuality. Marking edit points. If we are using destructive editing, by the way, a good example and follow through is in your textbook. Look at figure 5.2 to guide you along with that. What you want to do is highlight the portion of audio that you want to remove, and then you cut the segment out. The way that we do that in Adobe Audition and in Audacity makes it so that you simply highlight the portion that you do not want, and you can either Control X to cut if you're going to take that piece of audio and move it somewhere else in the WAV file. You can also just simply hit delete on the keyboard to remove it altogether. And again, you can always immediately undo anything that you do by mistake because Control Z is your friend. Once you've saved your edit, you cannot undo the edit. The file has been permanently changed. So if you are engaging in destructive editing, be sure that you want to keep what you have. But what happens here is if you have a WAV file that you call up under the file name, for example, test.wave. You make your edits and then you save your new creation as test.wave. That means the original test.wave is no longer there because you've overwritten it. That is destructive editing. Once you've made your saves and committed to them, there's no turning back. Using non-destructive editing, you can edit the file by marking and choosing certain regions within the sound file that you want to play back, and there's instructions on how you can do that in Adobe Audition in your textbook. Another simple way of using non-destructive editing is once you've done your edits, to save your file as a new file name. So in the previous example, if we have a file called test.wave and we make edits to it, save your new file as something different, like test revision 1 or test edit 1 or something like that. Give it a different file name so that you still have the original file if you need it but then you also have saved the edits that you made with the creation of a new file with a new name. Why use non-destructive editing? We've kind of gone over this a little bit already, but to spell it out, it provides a margin of safety that destructive editing cannot provide. In other words, if you make a mistake and you've made your save using non-destructive editing, that means you still have an opportunity to go back and fix your mistake because you still have the original file. That original file is preserved. You can reuse or change the sound bite by creating new segments without having to duplicate the file. That's a really, really nice thing to be able to lean on. One thing that's not in the book that you want to keep in mind, to take your files and as you save them after you edit them, to name them something different than what the original file name was, so that you have several different incarnations of the file that you are working with. Recording and editing talent. Give your talent the opportunity to try several different approaches to interpreting the script. Use different inflections, different words that you provide emphasis on, different timing and pacing and all those sorts of things. We talk about that when you take the broadcast speech class. Each separate recording is called a take, and talent should provide a voice slate for each take with some distinguishing notes. And it can be something as simple as, this is Fred Brucker's recording of Campbell's Soup, take 1. And the next recording would be take 2, and on and on and on. This provides you with an easy way to identify the different takes in an audio fashion as you're going through the file that you're working on. If the talent stops and then wants to start again in the same take, make sure that there's a pause to make editing easier. What I like to tell talent is stop, take a breath, and then start that sentence or thought over again, because it's going to make things a lot easier for the person that has to edit, as well as providing the talent the opportunity to try to keep a similar sort of cadence, rhythm, flow, so that once the edit is made, that things sound natural. A common problem encountered by editors is a change in audio level when recording different voices used in a commercial. It's vital that you listen carefully to your audio recordings before you release the talent. Even when you're careful to work with the talent, it is possible that, say there's a break in the action and they walk away from the studio and they come back in, they might be at a different distance from the microphone, so the sound quality might be different. They may use more or less emphasis than what they did in the original recording, and the recordings don't quite match up. Anytime that there's something that could create that sense that things were not done in one sitting, and it sounds unnatural, that's an opportunity for you to re-record and try to make the recording right so that it sounds appropriate to the listener once the final product is released. Copying, pasting, and looping. Many production music pieces have the ability to be edited to shorten or lengthen the amount of audio to fit for time. Most digital audio workstations allow you to create a region within a sound file. This is called a loop. Just as the name implies, a loop is useful for taking a small segment of music or a sound effect and making it longer. And there's a good example of what this would look like in your textbook. So basically, for those of you that are musically inclined, a loop would be a segment of music that's cut in such a way that you could take that piece of music and put a copy of it right next to it, but those copies right up next to each other, and it sounds like it's a continual music piece. Editing music takes practice and patience, but it's a skill that is definitely worth learning. Music editing gives you great flexibility in radio production, largely because if you're able to manipulate your sound in such a way that the music selection sounds like a complete piece, fits within the time constraints that you may have on a production, There's this thought of fullness and completeness in the way that things sound that is pleasing to the listener, while also meeting the requirements that we have for what has to happen within a production and meeting the requirements for time as well. Using alternative technologies, devices like the smartphone and the iPad have a number of software packages that allow for editing in the field. Microphone adapters and connectors make it possible to attach high-quality microphones using the tablet as a flash recorder. Some newer smartphones even have decent enough microphones built into them that for certain situations you might be able to get away with just using the microphone in your smartphone. Once the sound files are edited, they can be emailed or uploaded via FTP, file transfer protocol. That way the station can pick those files up from that FTP and download them and play them back immediately. As far as dubbing goes, when you dub, you essentially copy a source in one location to another location or to a different medium. It's taking audio in one particular format or in one particular location and making it into a different format or to a different location. It can be a problem when you're dubbing with an MP3 file or a mini disc in which the audio has been compressed, or when you've recorded originally on analog tape machines like a cart or a cassette tape or a reel-to-reel, because every new dub of a recording is basically a generation of that audio. And as you go from generation to generation and generation, there is a minimal loss of quality that happens. So if you dub a piece of audio too often, you lose too many generations, you can have a rather noticeable loss of quality. And that can include the introduction of various artifacts or additional noises into the recording process. And if you do that too many times, it could, as a result, wind up making a recording unusable. Some of the advantages of dubbing: it allows you to overlap elements, such as talking over a piece of music. It can also be accomplished very quickly, especially with computer files, simply copying a file from one window and pasting it into another, or doing it very simply even within digital audio workstation software. And that's going to do it. That's the notes for Chapter 5. This is more something that is better understood as you do the process, but we will take time to talk about this in class. Bring your questions, bring your comments. Don't forget to do the homework assignments attached with the chapter. And when we get together in class, we'll talk editing.